Hutchinson had previously interned for the House Minority Whip Steve Scalise and the Texas Senator Ted Cruz before she landed in the Trump White House. According to the Washington Post, many former Trump advisors were stunned to see Hutchinson testifying. As a fiercely loyal aide to Meadows, some believed she would defend him no matter what. For others, she was quite literally the last person that former Trump advisors expected to see testifying against their former boss in this investigation. One former White House official told the Post, quote, "She was totally enthusiastic about Trump and working in that White House," end quote. So the fact that Cassidy Hutchinson decided to testify publicly before the committee is in itself notable. And the fact that she did so despite being warned not to do so by Trump allies is also interesting. According to Punchbowl News, at least one of the two potential witness tampering messages presented by investigators yesterday was sent to Hutchinson. And because those close to Trump couldn't dissuade her from providing her damning account of what she saw in the White House, people in Trump world are now attempting to cast doubt over her testimony, specifically her recollection of what another White House aide told her about the former president lunging at a Secret Service agent in an attempt to take the steering wheel and head to the Capitol on January the 6th. Today, Hutchinson's lawyers tell MSNBC that she stands by her account, but whether or not Trump did throw a fit over not being driven to the Capitol is actually largely beside the point compared to her testimony that Donald Trump desperately wanted to march and lead a mob that he knew was armed to the Capitol. Joining us now is the California Congresswoman and member of the January 6th investigation, Zoe Lofgren. Congresswoman, thank you for being with us this evening. Cassidy Hutchinson tonight is standing by her testimony as sources who are close to Tony Ornato and the Secret Service claim that Ornato and Bobby Engel, the Secret Service agent whom Trump allegedly lunged at, would testify under oath that what Hutchinson testified about did not happen. What do you make of those claims and the effort to cast doubt on Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony?
Well, her testimony under oath wasn't about what happened because she wasn't there. It was that Mr. Ornato told her that and that Mr. Engel was present and didn't deny it. So we'll see if they want to come in under oath and deny that, fine. The real point is no one is denying that the former president wanted to go to the Capitol and lead this armed mob and be there while they attacked the Capitol. That's the point. And it's no one can deny it. I mean, that she actually heard the president himself talk about removing the effing mags and that the armed supporters were not going to hurt him, that they can march from the ellipse to the Capitol is stunning and the most important revelation, really, I think, of all the things she testified to.
One of the Punchbowl News reported today that Hutchinson was one of the witnesses who was sent a message described by Vice Chair of the committee, Liz Cheney, as potential witness tampering. Now, on that issue, you said something tonight in another TV interview that I want to ask you about. You said, quote, "In a prior hearing, we talked about the hundreds of millions of dollars that the former president raised. Some of that money is being used to pay for lawyers for witnesses, and it's not clear that that arrangement is one that is without coercion potential for some of those witnesses." I want to ask you to elaborate on that. What did you mean by that?
Well, I mean, we know that large amounts of money have been spent out of the fund that was amassed by the former president and is being used to pay for lawyers to various witnesses. The potential for coercion in that case is pretty obvious. I'm not going to comment on which witness those threatening messages were sent to, but obviously if you read them, there's an intent to dissuade a witness from testifying honestly. So this is a concern. And I just want people who would try and interfere with a witness, who would coerce them or threaten them to know that that's not legal. And we do not intend to just sit by and watch that happen.
Well, let's explore that a little bit. Are you worried that the backlash that Cassidy Hutchinson is now facing by her former colleagues and the supporters of the former president, that may influence other witnesses and make them hesitant to come forward? And when you say we're not going to allow that to happen, what can you actually offer?
All I'm saying is, I mean, certainly Ms. Hutchinson, although she's young, is pretty wise. She knew, and we knew, that when she testified, Trump loyalists would try and undercut her testimony, attack her, belittle her, and try and discount her testimony under oath. And in fact, that's what's happening right now. But as to witness intimidation, that's a crime. Mm-hmm. And if individuals who are trying to protect the president are committing a crime, we intend to take the evidence that we get of that and not just sit on it. People ought to be aware that committing the crime of witness tampering is a serious matter, and it's not going to be ignored. As a lawyer, you know a lot about crimes, and I guess there are people involved in January 6th who may have been lawyers, may not have known about things. Pat Cipollone was a lawyer, is a lawyer, and a lot of information about him came out in yesterday's hearing. You have spoken to him on the committee at some point, but at this point you are asking, in fact, this evening, you have issued a subpoena. You want more information from him under oath. Tell me about that. Well, pretty clearly, if you watched the hearing yesterday with Ms. Hutchinson, he was relaying information to people other than the president, and we need to talk to him about it. There have been some informal discussions, but not the fulsome discussion that we need. We respect that there are some elements of the advice he gave directly to the president that may be subject to privilege. So, respecting that, we'll work through those issues. But clearly, some of what he said and did not fall into that category, and we need to talk to him, and we hope he comes in promptly. Congresswoman, thank you for your time tonight. We appreciate it. California Congresswoman and member of the January 6th investigation, Zoe Lofgren.